what's going on? And you were like, yeah, Russia's just invaded Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And from then it just all kicked off. We had no idea what was going on, and it just felt so weird for us to be just carrying on our lives, working in a restaurant, serving people mashed potato. It felt so wrong.
Yeah.
Today I'm joined by David Sharkey. David and I met in the restaurant that I started working in 2020. Since then we've stayed friends, haven't we, Sharkey?
For the most part.
Yep, okay.
I guess.
Moving on. He's helped me a lot with my mental health and grief, and I had the honour of celebrating his marriage to his wonderful wife Victoria back in April. But more importantly, in November 2022, David made the journey to Ukraine to distribute aid packages, where he was then documenting his experience and recently published his book, Remember. Hi David, welcome to the podcast.
Hello Gabby, thank you for having me on your podcast.
You're so welcome. So you were born and bred in Edinburgh.
Yep.
And you met your wife Victoria, who's Ukrainian. You were working together in a restaurant.
We're working together, yeah, down at the Botanics.
And she thought you were gay, because I remember
Yes.
in the wedding, she, I think, who was it that made the speech? Was it your best man? And he said, like, oh, and actually, Victoria, when she first met him, was like, are you gay?
My best man stole that from my speech.
Oh.
So when I got up to do my speech,
Then
he
had
had
to say-
taken the starting segment of my speech. I've not quite forgiven him for that yet.
And now you're married with a kid.
Yes.
Yeah. When you guys met back in, when was it?
Oh, now we were talking about it yesterday, so 2016. That's
Okay.
when we met, actually. Yeah.
And had you been to Ukraine before your trip recently?
Yes, we went over to Ukraine. I think in total it was 3 times.
Okay, so it wasn't
off
your
the top of
first
my
trip
head.
there.
The last time I'd been there actually was to be the best man at a wedding.
Mm-hmm.
So the last time I was in Uzhhorod was in June 2020, I think. So 2020, around that time for the wedding, and it was about 30 degrees, and I was wearing a kilt. It was very uncomfortable, and then I was just getting orders barked at me in Ukrainian for what I had to do. And when I was walking through Uzhhorod, which is the city that Victoria's from, which is right in the border with Slovakia and Hungary, I had people coming up to me wanting pictures taken with me.
You and your kilt.
Yeah.
People love it. My parents got married in France in like the city centre of Toulouse, and there was all these Scottish men wearing their kilts, and people were taking photos of them. Everyone loves it.
They love it. They also think we're mental.
Yes.
So yeah, so that was I had a lot of great experiences actually of Ukraine before that.
Yeah, of course.
And we obviously have good friends over there. And it was always such a nice place to go because it was so welcoming. We ended up spending on the previous trip. We spent a week in a farm near the city of Rivne as well. So we travelled a little bit around Ukraine. Not a great deal, but a little bit.
What were your impressions of Ukraine at that time?
Very different to what I imagined in my head before I met Victoria.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I always thought Ukraine, really poor. I had all the stereotypes in my head. Some of the stereotypes were kind of confirmed when we were picked up by a horse and carriage to get taken to the farm. And that was a bit weird.
Yeah.
But most of the things that I experienced, they were very, very positive. People were very friendly.
So you were surprised?
Yeah.
Yeah.
People were very friendly. It didn't matter that I didn't speak the language that we made do, and yeah, it was great.
So it's always been like, ever since you met Victoria, you've obviously had a soft spot for Ukraine. It's been something that's really important to you, and obviously her family. And now your son is half Ukrainian.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, the people were so... There's a warmth and there's a sense of community in Ukraine. So it's a country that's been through a very bad century of history, and it's made the people very, very tough in some ways. It's made it quite a tough society to grow up in, but it's also meant that people have put a lot more value in community and into each other, because people would have to rely on each other for even just simple necessities. And you've got very close-knit communities there,
So what made you, what fueled you to go? because I remember when you first told me, actually, you didn't even tell me. Do you remember how I found out from the manager at our work? Like, she just kind of spoke casually about it. She went, oh yeah, and like, you know, Sharky's going to Ukraine. And I remember my jaw dropped because I thought, wait, because obviously, like, when you hear something like that and you think about someone that you care about going to, you know, a war-torn country, and like, especially from what's like portrayed in the media in the UK, like, what I was imagining was a bit different from what I read in your book, especially at the start of your journey.
Yeah.
And I remember I texted you and I was like, what's this I hear about you heading into Ukraine? And you were like, look, well, obviously I wanted to tell you face to face, but it's something that I need to do. So what made you take that decision?
Well, obviously, the same as anyone, we'd seen the news and we'd seen what had been happening. I really kind of felt compelled to do something more, but the real instigator, the real catalyst to actually go and do that was the people that I met in relation to it. So the people at Sunflower Scotland, the charity I ended up going with, was the big thing as well. I could see the work that they were doing, and I could see, well, this is one of the very important things. You don't go to a country like Ukraine, you don't go into a war-torn country unless you know people that know what they're doing, know the country well, know people in the country, know what's safe, what isn't safe. And I count myself as very fortunate that I met Oleg and I met other people through the organisation who knew what they were talking about. So when Oleg came back the second time from Ukraine, he told me about the work that they'd been doing. And to be honest, he was a very big deciding factor in that, because it's seldom that you meet people that have clear motivations, that have a very clear vision of what they want to do, that isn't wrapped up in themselves, and they're trying to do something good. And I think in those situations, it's very, very good to try and put your weight behind these people and support them, because that's what they need. They've got the brain, they've got the knowledge, they've got the drive, but they need that support from people just to try and achieve all the things they want to. So when I met Oleg after he came back the second time...
How did you meet him?
I met him through Sunflower. I met him at a couple of fundraisers that we'd done, and I'd also met him when we were... Ironically, something that chagrins him to this day is that I met him as well when we were when we were getting supplies and putting them onto a truck. So
to go from Scotland to
Ukraine. So that was a prime example of the kind of thing they were doing. They were being innovative, and they were using their initiative to really make things happen.
And this is Sunflower Scotland.
Sunflower Scotland started literally about 2 days after the war.
Oh wow, okay.
And it launched, and it was so proactive that they contacted people in Ukraine. So it's delivery drivers, long distance, long haul delivery drivers with huge trucks. And straight away they were like, well, if you're coming into Britain with goods and you're returning empty, then why don't we just fill your truck? We'll pay the fuel for you. We'll pay the anything that you need for the taxis or tariffs on borders, or what any expense that they need was paid for by Sunflower. So that was initiated within 2 or 3 weeks of the war starting. So they were straight out the blocks.
I was with you. We were in the restaurant together I remember we were in the back and we were both looking at our phones. I remember just turning to you being like, what's going on? And you were like, yeah, Russia's just invaded Ukraine. And from then it just all kicked off.
Yeah.
And I remember it so clearly, because I remember how obviously Victoria was extremely upset. We had no idea what was going on, and it just felt so weird for us to be just carrying on our lives, working in a restaurant, serving people mashed potato. It felt so wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
Here's your mash.
Yeah, literally.
Now let me check the news.
Yeah, it felt so weird, just like carrying on with our lives while like a war had just, exploded in Europe. It was so odd.
I definitely for the first week. Well, no, I'd say longer than that, but certainly for the first few days, week, and a bit longer, I was in shock. I was definitely shocked the day it happened.
Yeah.
Because there's not been a war like that in European soil in so long, of that magnitude anyway. And it was, and I think it hits on a different level when you know people that are there, when you've been there. And it was just a really shocking day. But that kind of shock, that, I don't know. I feel like when I started coming out of that shock, I was like, well, we have to do something about this. It really, it became not an option to be motionless.
So how long after the war, like, breaking out, did it take you to decide to go to Ukraine?
I knew that Oleg had been in Ukraine. I think it was through his wife Elvira. So I actually messaged him when he was still in Ukraine on his way back the second time. And then we agreed to meet up when he came back. Now, Oleg was, I think the second time he came back, he said he dealt with it better, but he needed a period of decompression, because where he was the first and second time was very much at the forefront of the war. So he was in Kharkiv when Kharkiv was getting shelled and bombed daily. And in fact, he had one of his apartments that he'd rented the first time was destroyed about 2 weeks after he'd left Kharkiv. So he was in a state of kind of shock as well, from what he'd seen and what he'd experienced. When I went to meet him, it wasn't I was still toying with the idea.
And when was that?
That was August.
August, okay, so a couple months before you even left. So that was it took quite a while for you to actually...
I think we met up, and after we'd met and after we'd spoken and after Oleg had described the things we were doing, the way they were trying to help, and how good Sunflower's been at really kind of zooming in on specific areas, on specific issues, instead of being too wide-ranging. Because I think if you're a charity, especially a smaller one like Sunflower, if you try and be too wide-ranging, you end up doing everything sort of half-arsed rather than one thing really well. So he was telling me about where they'd been, about what they were about. And I think after that conversation, that was when I really thought, no, I want to go out with this guy. I want to support him. I want to support the charity. And I want to support Ukraine. Because one of the most frustrating things that can come from being a bystander in something like this, especially when you feel a personal affiliation, a personal connection, you get filled with impotent rage. You get filled with a lot of real frustration about the situation, and there's nowhere for that energy to go. And so when I met Oleg, I thought, no, this is somewhere where my frustration at what's happening and at the suffering that's going on, this is where I can channel some of this. This is a person that I can trust. This is a person that I know they know what they're talking about, and this is what I want to support.
And Oleg, he lives in Scotland, doesn't he?
Yeah. Oleg's lived in Britain, I think, for about 15, 16 years.
Am I right in saying that he's Russian?
So Oleg's a British citizen.
Okay.
He's been a British citizen for a long time. He was born in Moscow, but Oleg, I think it would be safe to say, he does not consider himself Russian, and neither do I.
Okay.
He's very much of the mind, as am I, that he's a British citizen. He's lived in Edinburgh for a long time. So
when you, a Scottish man, sat down in front and went, I want to come with you, how did he react? What did he say?
He was, as is with a lot of things that Oleg actually does, for all he's a badass and stuff, he's very, very measured. He's a measured badass. he doesn't rush into things. And he's not keen on people rushing into commitments without being 100% certain that they mean it.
And that they know what they're getting into.
Exactly. So I had, come to think, I had actually proposed to him beforehand. I'd proposed to him that I'd be potentially interested in coming. So his way of kind of not putting the fear in me, but the reality into me was, we went to a bar in Morningside, and and he literally just was like, he just dumped like shell, shrapnel, bullets, everything onto the table in front of me. And then he was showing me pictures, and he was like really to try and make me understand, to comprehend the places that they were going, and the the reality of the situation, you know what I mean?
But surely that's something you won't be able to comprehend until you're there in the flesh.
No, of course it's not.
Yeah.
But you have to give people, you owe it to someone. If they say they want to come, you owe it to them to give them as much of a
reality check sort of thing.
A reality check and a real impression that you can.
Mm-hmm.
So I thank Oleg for that, because he didn't miss and hit the wall. He really was like, you know, this is very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me, he was like, you can die literally on the spot. No warnings, no heads up, and it's just done.
So I have to ask, how did your wife Victoria react when you told her?
My wife and I have a very good relationship, which is she knows that I won't stand in her way of trying to do something she really wants to do. And while this one was maybe taking that to the extreme limits, she knows me well enough to know that once I've kind of went, no, I'm going to do this, there's not really going to be talking me out of it.
That was one thing.
But that was one of the things that Oleg also spoke to me about.
Mm-hmm.
So Oleg didn't know I had a boy, and Oleg, when we were chatting, he was like, "So do you have a family and stuff?" And I was like, "Yeah, I've got my wife, I've got my kid, who at that time was 2.5." And he was like, "Oh," and that kind of stopped Oleg in his tracks, because he was like, "Are you really sure about this? Because my sons are older, so if I get mahujad, if I die, it's not great because they're both young, but they're 19,
older,
20,
yeah.
I think, but they're, you know, or a wee bit older, maybe one of them's finished university now, but they're older, they've got their own lives, they're kind of independent, whereas it was like, you know, your son's 2.5."
Mm-hmm. He's very young.
And it was a massive thing to take into consideration. Of course it was. But there was two things that kind of came out of it, which is, it's fine and well looking after your own and thinking about your own, but there's plenty of 2.5-year-olds whose parents are getting killed in Ukraine, is one thing. And the second thing is that I realised that after the book, I mean, there's some reflections through the book where I kind of reflect on myself personally about my son and about imagining him in that situation. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, without intending to, I kind of wrote it for him as well, as a kind of, if you feel something, go and do something about it. But also, you know, this is how I felt as a person from Britain being there with respect to my family. So he, you know, there's definitely instances where I was like, I could draw that back, and think, you know, there's people that are living this reality right now.
What was like the flip that you were like, no, this is 100% certain?
Well, like I say, I think Oleg
was it speaking to him?
Was definitely a part of it, you know. And ironically, Oleg never said, "Come over with me." But like I said, you meet very rarely. You meet, and I don't use the term lightly, you meet inspirational characters who are doing something terrific, and all they're asking for is support. All they're asking for is for people to put their weight behind them. And when I met Oleg and other people in the organisation, because there's Vasi, who's done an amazing amount, Tanya and Elvira, and there'll be people in Sunflower Scotland that I have yet to meet, or I have met and unfortunately forgotten your name. But you know, there's really inspiring characters within that organisation, and that for me is something worth supporting. And that gave me a real sense of this is the right thing to do.
I'd like to start from the beginning. Like, did you drive from Scotland?
I met Oleg in Krakow.
Okay,
so I flew into Krakow.
You flew to Poland.
And met him there.
Okay.
So this is one thing that I haven't really told anyone about the book, but it wasn't just me and Oleg. There was actually a third person there who was such a moron that I wrote her out of the book.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
We brought a very well hidden narcissist with us.
Oh, no.
And she got dropped from the book because I was
Oh,
like,
God. Okay.
all right, you're not getting
Is
in
she
the book.
from Scotland?
So, she's from England originally. She's lived in Scotland a long time.
Okay.
But yeah, she was she was a
God.
complete tit.
Oh.
I say I wrote her out. It wasn't very difficult because she contributed so little when we got there. So little. It was. I don't know what she expected. I don't know if she expected a holiday. I don't really know if she
How
had
did you
any
meet her?
concept of. So she was working with Sunflower.
Okay.
And when I first met her, so her idea was to bring some aid over to Ukraine as well. And she got on board with the idea of coming back with Oleg to Ukraine, or going over to Ukraine with Oleg. And and my initial impression of her was very, very positive. She seemed very like, I'm going to do this, we'll do this, and blah, blah. And she came through with some aid, and she did all sorts of things. And I thought, right, fair play. But it's, as Oleg says, when you get into a war zone, when you get into that environment, it magnifies your personality 10 times over. There's nowhere to hide, and the traits of someone's character come out. It's an extreme circumstance. And it's a real test of your character as a person, I think. And that's... Unfortunately, it definitely drew out a couple of her less favourable traits, and really, magnified them. And it became quite clear quite early on that we kind of wished that she hadn't come.
And she was there the whole time?
She was there the whole time. Well, she was there until we got to Kiev on the way back, and then she made some half-hatched plan. There was a guy, an English guy there, that she connected with before we went, but on Facebook, and she made some half arse plan to go to meet him in Kiev and then go and stay for another few days in Ukraine. But it was all a bit ropey, the arrangements and stuff. So we ended up getting into Kiev during the biggest missile strike of the war, where we picked up Hannah, who's Tanya's mum. And
the woman's name's Tanya.
Tanya's one of the people in Sunflower Scotland.
Oh, okay, right.
So Tanya had asked of Oleg and I if we could pick up Hannah on the way back, because she lived further north in the country. I forget the name of the city, so I'm not going to try and remember it. But obviously, coming into the winter, with everything that had happened, her mum wanted to be evacuated and brought over to Scotland. So we agreed, obviously, to pick her up in Kiev. Little did we know, the afternoon we arrived in Kiev, massive missile attack. It was a couple of days after Kherson, so it was the Russian response to the Ukrainians having the audacity to taking one of their cities back. So, so we're at a gas station, bear in mind, to pick up Hannah, who then comes out. She comes across in her little pink bubble hat, and with a wee suitcase, and she says to Oleg in Ukrainian, I didn't see it, but 2 rockets have flown over this gas station. So the gas station was shut. So you're like, oh. And meanwhile, I'm getting messages. There's been massive explosions. There's been a huge power cut, blah, blah, like the lights are out, blah, blah. So at this moment, this woman who's made this half-arse plan to meet up with this guy who is not in Kiev, he's running late. Oleg tells her, and this is really where she crossed the line for me. Oleg tells her, and right, Oleg said this before we went, anything I say you follow. You've not been there, I've been there. I am in charge of this mission.
Of course.
And I thought, of course,
Yeah,
you've been there
obviously.
before, you know how it works. I'm a novice, I don't know how this works.
You're not going to answer back
So if
to
you
him.
say anything, I will do it. So we went through, if we're getting shelled, we went through all these different scenarios, okay? So Oleg said to this woman, get in the van, because she was arranging to meet this guy at the gas station, but he was still about half an hour, 40 minutes away. Get in the van, I will drive you to meet this guy, but we cannot stay in the middle of a gas station in Kiev during a missile strike.
Yes, obviously.
A huge missile strike. And she refused to go. And her response to him was, I'm not making you wait here. So she put our lives at risk through her own selfishness. She was that narcissistic.
Oh my
and
God.
that for me was one of those experiences where, like, at the time there's no time to argue.
Yeah.
So, like, literally Oleg pled with her really for about 5-10 minutes, and he's not the pleading type of guy, but he was like, really, you have to leave now. But she wouldn't listen to him. So we had to leave. So we left, me, Oleg and Hannah, while this idiot stood next to a gas station in Kiev while there was a rocket attack going on, waiting on this guy she's never met but connected with on Facebook, who's still half an hour, 45 minutes from collecting her because he's running late. Great. So
that is absolutely insane.
and that's the way some people behave in war zones when they're either too thick or just don't really get the reality of where they are. And that's what Oleg was worried about with me. And that was why when we spoke, he was very brutal about the reality. And that's why I agreed to follow his instruction when we went. But this woman didn't, so...
So you left her?
Yeah. I did consider writing a couple of bits about her in the book, and I decided, you know what, this isn't about her.
Yeah, it's not about
But
her.
it is an example of how stupid people can be in dangerous situations.
Do you know what happened to her?
She got picked up eventually.
Okay.
She got picked up eventually, and then she severed connection with Sunflower Scotland when she got back to Edinburgh.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
What?
Because Sunflower Scotland wanted to have an inquiry with her and be like,
yeah, obviously.
what do you think you were doing in Kiev? And she just severed connection. She didn't want to have the confrontation. She didn't want to have to answer for herself. And let's say 2 or 3 days afterwards, I was chatting to Oleg on the drive back. I think we were in Germany at that point. And we're absolutely furious. Because as I said, I'm taking a chance being there. I've got a young son at home. She's got about 3 kids.
That's so...
And there she is standing next to a gas station. I'm like, who's looking after the bairns if you drop dead right now?
That's insane.
You know what I mean? So it wasn't just selfish in terms of risking our lives, but it was risking her life. And, you know, the
stability of her
huge
children.
impact that would have on her children. So
That's insane.
it was absolutely bonkers.
Well, you know what? We're not going to give her any more time.
Let's
talk about when you set off. So that was was it the 8th of November?
Yes. Yeah.
8th of November. You set off and you met Oleg in Poland.
I would have been, I think it might actually been the 7th I met him in Krakow. And then the 8th we crossed over.
How were you feeling?
It was pretty bad at the airport. Because Victoria, God bless her, she has a way of avoiding thinking about something until sometimes it's impossible to not think about it. So she cracked at the airport gate, and Roman was there as well.
Oh no.
So it was a heavy departure, but once I was in the air and stuff, it was kind of, I'm here now, so let's go. It was not the easiest departure.
What were you expecting when you crossed the border?
I was expecting it to be less than 1,000 kilometers before I saw the first bomb craters and stuff. We skirted, so we went around Lviv, and I think I would have seen parts of the war in Lviv, like the destruction. But I really anticipated, especially from, even though we've got friends in Ukraine, I really anticipated getting into Ukraine and finding it really depressed and, you know, signs of the war maybe more frequently.
That's what...
But certainly people being like really, really broken.
That was something that I found really interesting in your book when I was reading about when you entered and you were quite taken aback by the city, the first city you hit. What was the first city that you went to? So the first place that we first entered a village. So we went around Lviv. It was in Lviv Oblast. And because I wasn't really, I had very tentative plans to write this book. So I really, at that stage, wasn't, and it was the first time doing this sort of thing. So I didn't quite document everything as well as I wish I had. So the first village we entered. Okay. And I remember reading in the book about how you were taken aback by how people were just like living their life normally, and you said that to Oleg, and he said, this is the one thing that people think, that Ukraine is a broken state, and it is not a broken state.
No,
and that really hit me really hard, because I like the way that our media is, like the things that our media is showing us, I'm like, what we're imagining is a country that's completely destroyed, that there's nothing left, that there's probably bodies on the side of the road, that like there's dead animals, like, you know what I mean, that we're like we're given this extreme view. And I could feel the anger from Oleg in the book, being like, we're not broken state, we're still here, we're still going, we're still working. And I found that really touching, because it's not at all what I had imagined.
Absolutely. I mean, that was kind of, we went to a village in Lviv Oblast.
Yeah, that was the first day.
Yeah. And that was on the way to Zhytomyr, and a beautiful wee village, big man-made lake. I still remember seeing the boats and a couple of yachts and stuff in this lake.
Yachts?
Tied up to the pier.
Okay.
Yeah, not poor, really not poor. Beautiful wee village, and then we go into this shop to the Bureau de Change, and the shop is packed with people, with food, with everything. I was like, and obviously so they were the times I wasn't quiet. I think I said to you before, I was only there for a short period, but the amount you can learn if you keep your mouth shut and your eyes open is phenomenal, because you're observing, you're taking things in, you're taking what people say in as well. But obviously at times I was asking questions, because I was like inquisitive. But
and also you can't shut up.
Yeah, well, as you can tell by this podcast, I don't mind talking. But that I had to ask questions sometimes that were just so obvious, I guess, to him. And when we went there, I was just like, I can't believe there's all this stuff here. And he was like, well, yeah, most people think you're going to cross over the border from Poland or from Hungary or Romania or many other countries that border Ukraine, and you're just going to meet these people on their hands and knees, groveling for food and for whatever. And I think in opening sort of 20-25 pages, that's one of the things that I try to grapple with. And to try and break that perception about Ukraine, because the idea that Ukraine is broken, and the idea, and we might as well go into it now, that sending food to Ukraine is sensible, is unbelievable, to be honest. It's so incredibly stupid. What you've got, and what I got to appreciate much more when I was there, you've got somewhere that is the breadbasket of the world. If you look at their agricultural numbers, they're off the chart. And what you've got is the world sending free food to a country that makes surplus food so much that now there's parts of the world that are in a food crisis because Ukraine can't get its food out. And we're sending free food to a country that creates all this food whose economy is about to retract by 30%.
Is it not that the Ukrainian soil is like incredible and anything can grow in it?
Yeah, it's very, very fertile.
Yeah.
So it's black soil.
So we're sending food to somewhere that like we're actually crippling their economy because we're putting people out of business by handing out free food.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm absolutely furious about it, because what you've really got, you imagine when the war started, everyone's in shock, as we discussed before. You're trying as a government or as organisations to deal with this, to put plans into action on the hoof, really, because I don't think anyone really anticipated, well, not in the West. I think other countries in the East are less naive than the West. But in the West, we were still like, oh, Putin won't go to war.
We were.
So we were caught off guard. We were caught off guard. It was convenient to think that Russia would keep to its word of not invading. So we had plans that were really done on the hoof. But what I've seen in the last year and a half, since the start of the war, or 17 months, absolutely no development, absolutely no evolution of the plan. And I'm absolutely furious with people in the Scottish government, people in the British government, and other organisations that should know better, that are basically wasting the generosity of Scottish people on crap that Ukraine does not need. And it's absolutely criminal that organisations and people are still getting courage to send free food to Ukraine. It's not just shocking, it is, it's just pure neglect of duty from people that should be doing better, who should be leading and should be informing people, but they're not. So Scottish people whose generosity cannot be in question. I found it very heartwarming how much Scottish people have given. A lot of that generosity is being wasted because we're not being informed properly about what is appropriate aid, what we should be sending, what Ukraine actually needs. So because people first associate disasters like this with, well, we need to make sure they have the basics. So they need to have shelter, they need to have food, we need to have sanitary products, etc., etc. The natural inclination for people, when they're not more informed, is, well, let's send food to make sure they don't starve, to make sure that people are actually healthy, families, etc. But because that's actually having the opposite impact on the country, we are creating more harm than we are good by sending food. And that's a very, very difficult thing to recognise, because that means there's an incompetence at such a level in organisations and in governmental departments that are meant to be looking after this, that is absolutely unacceptable. Unacceptable.
So what can we do?
For me, when it comes to aid, and we discovered that while we were there, if you have good communication with Ukrainian government, for example, or Ukrainian charity organisations, you should be able to compile a list of aid that is needed in the country. Mm-hmm. So Ukraine still needs support, of course it does, but not with food. So stop wasting your money on food, mm-hmm. Stop wasting your time with food and clothing. Mm-hmm. What are we doing sending clothing over there? Yeah. And unless you get photographic evidence of where that food or that clothing is gone, I can almost guarantee you it's been sold at the other end. Because that's what happens during war. It magnifies everything, it x-rays everything. And Ukraine, God bless it, it is quite a corrupt country. Mm-hmm. The same way the UK is a corrupt country, but when war comes, it's for many people, it breeds uncertainty. But for some people, it creates opportunity. So there's definitely been Ukrainians at the other end that have been gathering these goods, that have been getting this food, that have been doing that, and they've been selling it.
So when you were there, where were you getting the food from? Were you buying food locally in Ukraine, or had you brought it over from Scotland?
No, we bought from a wholesaler in Kharkiv.
Okay.
And even, I mean, this is why communication is vital, right? So Daniel on the ground in Kharkiv as a native, war changes so quickly that you need to have communication with people that know what they're talking about, because basic goods or essential goods or what is needed changes very quickly. Mm-hmm. So some of the goods that we did bring, so there's like bags that were put together for like maternity bags that were put together for like new mothers. Mm-hmm. Even the generator we had in the back that went to the army, we realised after we got to Kharkiv, we could actually bought them in Ukraine. But 2 months ago, before that,
you wouldn't have been able to.
No chance. So that's how quickly war changes, that even people that are involved in a very intimate level can be caught on the hop. Mm-hmm. Because they're going, oh, Christ, right? Mm-hmm. I know not to bring food, but I didn't know not to bring this or to bring that. Mm-hmm. So that for me shows there's been such a lack of development, such a lack of evolution when it comes to the humanitarian response to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the people, and dare I say all the people that are involved in the Ukrainian response team, haven't even been into Ukraine since the start of the war. So you've got people with very big opinions, mm-hmm. who don't know what they're talking about, who are actually the people responsible for guiding the humanitarian response of Scotland, who literally haven't been there.
That must enrage you.
It's
It
absolutely
enrages me.
pathetic.
It's
pathetic.
disgusting.
And Oleg reached out to the Scottish government and offered his expertise and his experiences, and offered to actually give them more information as he went back.
Mm-hmm.
And the Scottish government responded by saying, we do not encourage people to enter Ukraine just now, so we will not be supporting small NGOs. And they weren't interested in getting information from Oleg. So you've literally got people that are controlling the narrative and controlling policy, who are less informed than me, a waiter that spent 8 days in Ukraine. How ignorant is that? And how disappointing is that?
It's more terrifying than anything else.
And how much are we then letting down Ukraine as well?
Yeah, of course.
And I feel very much for Scottish people that haven't just given aid, but also taken Ukrainians in, that have really got involved in this.
Mm-hmm.
They've been let down as well in a huge way, because all those times they've sent stuff and thought, I'm doing the right thing, through no fault of their own,
Mm-hmm.
they've actually made the problem worse.
Do you think you'll go back?
I would... I'm on a waiter's wage. So... So it's hard to imagine being able to afford to go back, because when me and Oleg went, none of the expenses were charged to charity. So all of the fuel and the hotels and our food, etc., were paid for by us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite expensive, but obviously a price I was willing to pay.
You ever thought about starting a fundraiser?
It's a tough one.
Would you want to
So
go
basically,
back?
I would like to go back.
Okay.
For sure. I'd love to go back. And at the moment, Sunflower Scotland's in the process of buying a refrigeration unit, which will go down, I'm not sure about the region, I think it might be Zaporozhye, but I might be wrong about that. And that refrigeration unit truck type thing has been requested because with their connections in Ukraine, because of bodies. So bodies obviously during the summer have been festering, and it's very, very bad for disease, but also with the rains of the winter and stuff coming, it washes bacteria and other things into the rivers.
Of course.
A lot of the soldiers are drinking from the rivers directly, so you're getting dysentery and other sort of sicknesses among the soldiers, which is obviously can have disastrous consequences.
How close did you get to the front line?
The closest we got to the front line was 2 kilometers. That was at Luhansk.
And how was it there?
Well, we didn't... in hindsight, it was quite funny. At the time, it really wasn't. But we ended up... There was a car that was parked across the road on this... Yeah, this wee country road. And there was a bit of convoy, about 8 cars, actually. And military car parked across the road, and we're like, okay, I guess we'll be stopping. So I actually was going to go out and get a cigarette, and I opened the door and literally had a guy bark at me in Ukrainian. And I was like, okay then. Daniel was next to me, it's like, no leave. I was like, okay, I'll just sit here. And then there was shell fire to the left of us, and it was up on this like field, like not really close, a few hundred yards away. And I was like, that's a bit close. And I turned to Daniel and I was like, is that Russian or ours? Because everyone looks really calm if that's not ours. And he was like, I'm not sure. I was like, all right, well, that's reassuring. Okay, thanks, Daniel. Next time, lie. And and then a couple of minutes later, we realised it was actually Ukrainians testing out the armory and the ammo and etc. etc. And this guy eventually waved us through, pulled into the side, waved us through, and we were passing a group of soldiers. I don't know if they just did it for a laugh, but they literally opened fire with a machine gun just as we passed. So I absolutely shit my pants. I was like, well, we need to stop for a cigarette now. Because I'm absolutely shiting it. But yeah, so the Russians were just over the hill from where we were.
Okay.
But it was one of the areas where it'd been one of the areas where they'd retaken a lot of land in the 2 months leading up to when we went. So the September, October offensive. And I think, although it can be very misleading, I think the fighting there was much more tit for tat. It wasn't really full on aggression, because it was almost the Ukrainians were trying to resettle their new line and the Russians were trying to resettle theirs as well. So it felt very stalematey.
And can I ask, where was the worst place you saw that had been affected by the Russians?
That's quite hard to say, because there was places where there was more destruction, and probably a lot more dead people.
Did you see any dead people?
No.
Okay.
No, not while we were there. Because the front had moved so quickly, so so everyone's got a role to play in the war, and so a lot of if people aren't fighting, they're doing something else. I talk about the maintenance workers in Ukraine who have done an incredible job, because they've repaired jobs, repaved them, and done them within like lightning speed. We're talking like 2, 3, 4 days. And they make sure that the electricity is still going. They make sure that, all this unbelievable work. And there's other people that also have gone out and taken dead bodies off of the fields, including Russian ones, to avoid disease, to avoid any potential health risks that might come with it, but also out of decency as well. So a lot of the regions we ended up being in were a couple of months after they'd been liberated. So no, I didn't see any, and I didn't fancy hunting about either. And a lot. The worst area I was in, I think, just in terms of populace, would have been northern Saltivka, which is in the north part of Kharkiv, which was absolutely horrendous. That was like walking through hell on earth. And that was, you're talking giant tenement blocks that are, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 stories, and just literally just ripped apart. I mean, you could see right through them. You could see into living rooms. You could, you had to shield your eyes against the sunset, because it'd be going right through the building. It was that ripped apart. And that went on for many miles. I mean, we didn't have time the day that we went to see part of Northern Saltivka. We didn't have time to go and see it all. But the estimates in the population of that area is between 100 and 500,000. The border for Northern Saltivka is very undefined, really.
How many Ukrainians have lost their lives throughout this?
No idea.
Really?
Yeah, and I mean that one of the things that we discuss is that numbers are important. They're all fine and well. It's good to know the scale, and it's good to appreciate the amount of people that have died and the amount of damage that's been done. But you shouldn't focus on numbers too much. You shouldn't focus on the math of the war, because it can desensitize it. So I ended up kind of being much more conscious of looking at the destruction and speaking to people about what they'd witnessed, the wider ramifications. I mean, that was another reason that me and Oleg never spoke about war movements, about unit movements, about what we thought would happen in the war. That's not really chat that was very interested in, neither was he, because when you get down to a personal level, it becomes a horrible, massive idea that you kind of go, I don't want to talk about this. This is this is just, it starts to move away from the personal impact, whether soldier or civilian, and it starts to move more towards kind of making it more digestible, and talking about, fantasies of where the army's going to go or how the war's going to play out is just that. It's a fantasy, but it's not a fantasy, it's a reality. So it didn't feel appropriate to talk about it.
Of course.
We didn't learn about the numbers of people who died, but Northern Saltivka will be remembered for a long time after this war, because we're talking about nurseries and hospitals and medical centres that have been blown up.
Oh, wow.
And I went to one of the nurseries that was there, and they had flowers, bouquets of flowers laid out on the little beds in the dormitory. And it was just horrendous. And I always remember we took some photos around there. We were very, very quiet there because the sheer scale was unimaginable, and it was something that really stops you in your tracks. And I remember we were taking pictures because I wanted to obviously document it. All the windows are blown out, so when you get a shell that lands on a street, obviously if it's a building, it hurts that building, but the shockwave usually destroys all the windows in the surrounding buildings. So because Saltivka, there was not a pane of glass, so these flats are not only destroyed, there's no glass. We're taking photos, and a little old woman about 3 stories up came to the edge of the balcony and looked down at me, and I was absolutely gobsmacked. And then she scurried back inside.
You think she's still living there?
She was still living there. So there were still people living there. And that was with the onset of winter coming. They've got no windows, no heating, obviously, presumably no electricity. So it was astonishing to actually see, like, there's still people actually living here. You know what I mean? So northern Saltivka was horrific. But, we went through many towns that have been just razed pretty much. Villages, Vilkivka was another one that will stay in my memory, because that was the bizarrest thing, like the whole thing flattened except this one house and one guy working away in his garden. Like nothing had happened. And I was like, this is nuts. Yatskivka, coming down the hill towards Yatskivka. Kopiansk was Lefki. Sorry to any Ukrainians out there that have had to listen to that. That's another part that just outside Kopiansk, which has just been leveled. Didn't even see one house there that was standing. Korilivska, which was again that was almost worse than Saltivka, because you could see where the floors used to be, and it's just a pile of rubble. So I'm assuming that it just collapsed under some shelling. We didn't go into Izium as much because the military commander that we spoke to in Izium was on the outskirts of the town, so next to the river Oskil. But Izium is where there's been mass graves found. So there's been 3 or 4 mass graves in Izium, all of which count over 200 or 300 people in them. So it depends. There's just variations of terribleness. There's not really one you can pinpoint and go, that was the worst.
And what's the situation now? Because obviously you went in November. What's changed?
Not a great deal, to be honest. I think the Ukrainians obviously on their well-documented counter-offensive down in the southeast of the country, which is horrendous. That's going to take a long time because the Russians have built a lot of defences, and they've mined everywhere. They've mined everywhere. So when we went down to Izium, the road that we took was very heavily mined. And there was 2 volunteers that were killed there a week after we'd been there on the road. So the mining in Ukraine is horrific. You couldn't pay me enough to walk through a Ukrainian forest for the next 40 years. There will not be a place in Ukraine. There'll be places in the west, but if we're talking eastern Ukraine, right in the heart of the war, and northern Ukraine, there will not be a place there that I would set foot without knowing it's been swept to mines, because they're so widespread. Because the Russians have kind of went, fuck it, if we can't have it, neither can you. So let's just mine the hell out of it, and you might advance, you might even manage to push us out, but we are going to tear your country apart in the process. The situation now is just truly dreadful.
How do you feel?
I don't know, really. We and Oleg, I don't think I actually put in the book, me and Oleg, her thoughts are that Ukraine unfortunately won't win the war. So it's not that Russia will win the war, if you can call it winners or losers when it gets to the stage it has. I think there'll be a deal made eventually, and Ukraine's going to have to cede territory. I personally have the feeling of kind of like, well, that's obviously not an ideal scenario, but I want the war to finish as soon as possible. So I feel very conflicted about the whole thing, because it's the civilians that we really want to speak to, and it's always the civilians that really suffer. It's always the civilians that get put into the line of fire and have bombs dropped on them. Really, the soldiers are unbelievable in Ukraine. We met many of them, and they're very inspirational characters, quite phenomenal people. For the civilians is disaster. And I mean that kind of segues into another part of my anger and my frustration. We've taken many refugees from Ukraine, and I hope every single one of them has been made to feel welcome. Ever since they've set foot on Scottish soil, I hope that they feel safe and secure, which is a basic human right, safe and secure. But it's another massive thing that I'm frustrated about. There was hurdles to getting onto House of Ukrainian scheme that by de facto really meant that if you were poor Ukrainian, if you didn't have access to the internet, if you didn't speak English, you ain't coming to Britain. So there's many parts of Ukraine that we went to, and I thought, you ain't getting on the House of Ukrainian scheme. So we ended up taking a lot of people, and again, this is absolutely nothing against Ukrainians who have come here. Not in a million years. You'll not meet anyone more supportive than me of Ukrainian refugees and of Ukrainian people. But we took people who were affluent, who spoke English, who had access to the internet, who could afford to leave the country in a way that many Ukrainians can't even imagine. So there is many people in Ukraine, the refugees. So this isn't against Ukrainian refugees here. This is for the Ukrainians that remain. There is thousands of Ukrainians who need help and who will not receive it because they are not rich enough and they don't have the English or any of these things in order to get help. And so what I ask of the Scottish government or the British government or organisations that might be dealing with this, what have you done about that? Absolutely nothing. Zero. So if you aren't going to fact find, if you're not going to go and really try to reach people that are in the most desperate situations, especially in the east of Ukraine, because the east of Ukraine, believe me, that is the red zone. The whole of Ukraine is amber. But you cannot compare someone, and I don't want to compare people. This isn't about meritocracy because everyone in Ukraine suffered. But please don't compare someone who's been in Kiev, for example, to someone that is in Kharkiv, or someone that's in Borova or Kopyansk, or Izium, or Zaporozhye or Kherson. These are the regions that need the most help. And the lack, again, of evolution of initiative to do anything about that reality for thousands of Ukrainians, that makes me furious as well.
And for the people listening that feel a bit helpless and don't really know what to do, what can we do?
The first thing I think that would be very helpful is put your faith in charities and what they're doing. People like Sunflower Scotland, and there will be other organisations out there. Sunflower Scotland's the one that I met. They know what they're talking about. They've got networks on the ground. They know people in Ukraine right now who are doing work. They're the type of organisations you should speak to. Don't bother with the Red Cross. Don't bother with the UN. Don't bother with the big corporations because they've used this. They use a blanket approach. So let's treat Ukraine like it's Somalia and just pump loads of free food in. That'll help. Let's pump loads of free clothes into the country. That'll help. So they've actually treated, so the big corporations, the huge charities, have just treated Ukraine like it would any other country. And that again, I don't know if it's laziness or ignorance. The same with the Scottish government, the same with the British government, the same with other organisations. I don't know if it's laziness or ignorance. But either way, it's bloody unacceptable.
Of course.
And so I think with Sunflower Scotland, I found a charity I knew I could trust, and I could see where the money was going.
And now you've been yourself, so
And
you've
I've
seen
been
it
myself.
firsthand.
Yeah.
You've done it firsthand.
And they have evidence for everything that goes to places.
And they're based in Edinburgh?
Yeah, they're based in Edinburgh.
And I wanted to ask, what was it that the Ukrainians and the soldiers kept saying about Putin? What was their little saying?
What? Fuck Putin?
Yeah. No, but there was like a, what was it? There was like a full sentence.
Oh, well, if it's about the Russian army, that was quite a good one.
Mm-hmm.
That was Russia once had the second best army in the world. Now it's got the second best army in Ukraine. It was indicative quite a lot of the humour that the soldiers had. Having met civilians and met soldiers, I actually think that if we're talking about mental health, I actually think a lot of the soldiers have got the best mental health in Ukraine just now, because they have a purpose. They have their brotherhood with other soldiers. I found their company very relaxed compared to a lot of the civilians. A lot of the civilians were very on edge, understandably, of course.
Of course.
But they were always making jokes.
Yeah, I saw a lot of it, like, fuck Putin, they kept saying, like, Russia, go fuck yourself, or something like that.
No, it was Snake Island. That was near the start of the war.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a unit that was on Snake Island, and the communique between them had been released because it was a Russian Navy ship that was demanding their surrender. Now, the Snake Island might have some strategic or tactical use that I'm not aware of. It's actually in Ukrainian hands again now, but Snake Island is a spit of land. I mean, it really is a ridiculous thing. You know, think of a Ukrainian craggy island. You know what I mean? It's literally just something that's, you know, you could probably walk across it in about half an hour. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, the Russians have got into their head, right, we need to take Snake Island, right? So a Russian naval ship told the Ukrainian soldiers to surrender or they would open fire. And obviously, they've not got the kind of firework, you know, they haven't got the firepower to fire back at this naval ship. And after a brief pause, the Ukrainian soldier replied over the radio, Russian warship, go fuck yourself. And that has become a synonymous thing, that like a saying, a quote that is just spread across the country. It set the tone for Ukraine's resistance and resilience in the face of Russia. That's what it did.
I have one last thing to ask you.
I hope so, because I really need the toilet.
I would love if you signed my book.
Of course.
I have here. Here you go.
Yeah, of course I will.
Thank you. And for anyone who would like to buy David's book, it's on Amazon, and all the money goes to, is it Sunflower Scotland?
Yeah, it goes directly to the charity.
Goes directly to Sunflower Scotland. And honestly, an amazing book. I honestly really, really loved it. As much as it's obviously a horrible thing to read, it's something that people should read.
I hope so. I wanted it to be something that did Ukrainians justice.
Of course.
I will add as well that there's quite a big, I don't know if I'd want to describe it as a twist at the end of the book, which might change a few things.
Okay.
But that's how I'll leave that. A little teaser for the reader.
David, I love you. Thank you so much for coming on.
I love you too, Gabs.
Oh,
thank you for having me on.
you're so incredibly welcome. Thank you. Oh, here we are.